waterfront in Nova Scotia during World War II. She wrote her undergraduate honors thesis on women's involvement in the shipbuilding and ammunition industries in Pictou County during the Second World War. She is currently writing her master's thesis on entertainers during the Second World War in Halifax. And we are absolutely delighted to welcome Kirby Ross to speak to us this evening.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It's been a while since I used a microphone, but if you need me to crank up the volume, that's okay. I've worked in tourism for quite a long time, and I don't mind yelling. Alrighty, so here up on the slide, we have a little bit shortened title. I didn't want to cram a whole bunch into one slide, but today I'll be talking about women in the war at home, Pictou County's women in industrialized work from 1939 to 1945, and I'll be focusing on the new woman worker of shipbuilding. Before I get into that, I want to thank the Royal Nova Scotia Historical Society for having me here today. I am so excited to talk about my research, and I also want to thank the Halifax Women's Historical Society, or History Society, for helping me get here today. For those of you who are unaware, the Halifax Women's History Society, well, it's pretty explanatory in the title, but they focus not only on Halifax women, but women throughout Nova Scotia, and they've worked on lots of projects, including the Volunteers Monument on the waterfront. If you haven't had a chance to go down, I highly suggest taking a look, as it focuses on women's volunteerism during World War II. And with that, I'll move on to my introduction, outline my presentation a bit, and then we'll go on from there. Great. So as Canada entered the Second World War, the opportunities for women had changed drastically, as a vast number of men were sent across the world to fight the Axis powers. World War II provided newfound opportunities for women to join workforces which had previously been closed off to them. Particularly, these new jobs were found in industrial settings that men left behind. Employers in Pictou County needed to replace the missing men, and women filled these positions. Industrial roles clearly differed from the domestic work that women primarily performed during the war years. And some of these jobs were in fields that women had performed during World War I, while others represented newfound opportunities. In Pictou County, these jobs included positions in factories, shipbuilding, and gunneries, and these jobs, as defined for the purpose of this presentation, will be known as heavy industry or heavy industrial work. Today, we'll be focusing specifically on women's newfound roles in shipbuilding. With labor shortages, the attitudes towards women working in these fields changed as demand grew for these jobs to be filled. The Second World War, however unintentionally, saw women make gains towards equality in the workplace, despite some women joyfully taking back their old domestic lives once men returned from the war. This was not the case for all women. More than 250,000 of Canadian women had joined the workforce for the World War II effort, and these experiences, of course, had an impact on their lives. Some women had detested the responsibility that came with being working mothers and wives and trying to balance these many different parts of their lives. And while some women had detested these opportunities or stepping out of these normative gender roles into an intensive industry at the time, many others liked this experience as it provided women with a glimpse of the potential freedoms and independence that they could have with better paying and full-time jobs. An overview of the economic and geographic stance of Pictou County will be started with, following by looking at the shipbuilding industry in Pictou County. Afterwards, a focus will switch to women's work, looking at the changes during World War I, just briefly, and then gun-hoing to World War II and the changes in the Pictou shipyards, as well as women's experiences and struggles working in this environment. The conclusion of the presentation will address the soldiers coming back as the war ended, and these sentiments of women as a majority would retire from their wartime positions. However, this experience shaped their identity of the women involved and this will be addressed along with an assessment of their experiences and a look of how this would impact the future. And with that, I'll switch on slides and talk about a little bit of an economic and geographic importance of Pictou County. Oh, great, wonderful. It worked on the first try. Perfect. Alrighty, so as many of you know, as this is the Royal Nova Scotia Historical Society, this is a map of Nova Scotia. And right up there by the Northumberland Strait, you can see the little town of Pictou, and right around it is the county of Pictou. Both are named Pictou. I know that could be a little confusing. But you can see that Pictou is located right on that shoreline, the Northumberland Strait, on the Nova Scotia Peninsula, and it is centrally placed close to New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, but also lots of Nova Scotia's economic centres such as Halifax, Amherst, Truro, and Sydney. And inhabited by Europeans since the late 18th century. Of course, long before this, it was inhabited by Indigenous peoples. Pictou has been a key component of Atlantic Canada's economy due to its rapid industrialization, but as well as its very strategic geographic location as well. Pictou officially became its own county in 1836, and the county comprises of significant towns such as Stellarton, Trenton, River John, Westville, and of course, the town of Pictou. Pictou County became, during the 19th century, one of the most uniquely industrialized regions of Nova Scotia and the Maritimes. The Pictou County shipyards were officially founded in 1856, but there's a long history of shipbuilding, well, quite long before that, and the first recorded ship was, I guess, finished in the late 1700s. Of course, there is quite a strong suggestion that there was shipbuilding before this. Shipping had complemented the county's stable lumber industry of the time, which unfortunately would eventually decline. The decline caused economic crisis for those in the lumber industry, as shipping transferred from wood to steel and metal. Due to this, along with economic downfall in general, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick tended to rely a bit on Confederation to deliver an economic boost. And for the time being, shipping would continue to dominate the identity of Pictou County as well as economy, although new trading opportunities did prove to be beneficial. Not only did uniting with Canada provide opportunity, but access to a larger railway network, as it was the century of railways. This dominated the economy. As the mercantile period ended, the predominance of rail transportation would help Industrial Revolution make its way to Pictou County. Nova Scotia had long been a coal-rich region, and this led to a turn in development of steam power and of iron and steel production, and this manufacturing and shipping industries were tied very well together, helping to support each other. Shipping for World War I, or the shipbuilding, was mainly dominated in the area by the Trenton Yards, one of the 5 major shipping yards in Pictou County. The yards closed only a few years after World War I, unfortunately, but Pictou shipyards took most of the work after this, especially for World War II, and Pictou shipyards will be the primary shipyard focused on in this presentation. Due to its geographic location, status as a small but vital economic hub in Nova Scotia, with a history of industrialization, the Pictou shipyards were picked by the Canadian government to build some of the Park ships as a project towards the World War II effort. They were picked to build 24 of the 182 commissioned ships, the others being, well, built elsewhere in Canada. But the Park ships were vessels that approximately weighed 4,700 tons, so quite huge ships. And because this was such a large project, the Pictou shipyards underwent construction, which finished in October of 1942, when they were then ready to start the Park Ships project. In 1939, there were 429 workers at the Pictou shipyards, but by 1941, still a year before this Park Ships project even commenced, that number had risen to 2,150 workers. Now, moving a little more towards women's history of work, women had typically taken on more domestic roles, whether it be working within homes, stores, retail, or helping out on farms in the region. Manufacturing, surprisingly enough, was a steadily producing jobs for women in Pictou County even since the 19th century. Women have frequently worked in producing clothing, tobacco, pottery, as well as spinning wheel factory, but canneries became the most common choice for women workers in Pictou County. Many of these being available in River John. This trend continued into the 20th century, and pea canning was one of the most popular and largely employed women, particularly in the decades before World War II. Women worked in manufacturing jobs to help provide financially for their families or for themselves, and depending on their socioeconomic status, this money was used either for luxuries or necessities in the home. Despite skill or experience, women were often hired based on their marital status. So single, unwed, of course, young women were often preferred for these jobs versus married or women with children. Employers generally continued to be influenced by prevailing ideas of the women of the woman and their traditional female in the home role when hiring. And though some factories, such as the pea cannery, were commonplace for women to work, other factories, such as dealing with munitions, iron, steel production, employed women rarely, if at all. Women were employed in more heavy industrial factories during World War I, including making munitions in Trenton, but once the war came to an end, so did this opportunity for women. So women entered the shipyards due to a high demand of workers for the shipyards in Pictou County, and there were not enough men to fill these roles. So in the fall of 1942, after that year of construction to expand the shipyards, women began to be recruited. The Pictou yards became the first shipping yards in all of North America to employ women. The National Selective Service was used to recruit these women and others for the wartime work, though companies like the Pictou shipyards had other methods of recruiting, such as sending scouts to rural areas to find more workers. Originally, the service looked for women who were unwed and childless between the ages of 20 and 24 to register for the service and then take the War Emergency Training Program, which prepared women for their wartime roles. Later, married women and then women with children were also considered and employed. The first recruited women were seeking part-time work, but then later they looked for full-time hires. The first hire of women only consisted of 12 employees, and local papers such as the Pictou Advocate did underestimate this development, predicting that there weren't going to be a lot of women working in the shipyards. Why would there be, right? And that this was too innovative of a direction to go in. But within a month, the Pictou shipyards had the highest rate of female employment in the yards in the whole country. And by the winter, there were 300 women employed there. Despite these positive changes, men were being groomed as candidates to stay in this type of work long after the war, whereas women were seen as a temporary solution. Men were given more training, actually twice as much training, about 12 weeks, and sometimes were even sent to the Nova Scotia Technical College to receive more formal training, where women were often only trained on site and for only 4 to 6 weeks. Women did everything in the yards from clean, pick up rivets, weld, drive trucks, work on plumbing, and because they were given less of a workload, they were paid less. Despite advancements and some good relations within the workplace between men and women, sexism and tension did exist throughout interactions, pay, and work conditions. This was the first opportunity for many women to even wear pants, and the nature of the job meant that women were often qualified to perform multiple tasks throughout the shipyard, unlike their counterparts in many other industries. Placing women in positions based on their gender was a form of sexism, but was unfortunately, in some ways, a step further towards workplace equality, as this had been an environment women were never allowed in before. Many women also struggled with acceptance of their jobs from their friends and family outside of the workplace, along with finding childcare. The workload between their jobs and family lives, as many women had gone jobs because their husbands or family members were off fighting in the war, was a heavy load to manage and can be hard to do on their own. Some women even brought their children to work, which I'll talk about a little more later, while others got families or neighbors to babysit for them. 1943 and 44 saw the highest employment at these shipyards with as many as 8,912 workers. By 1943, there were 747 women working within the yards. This perspective of local papers shifted, using language as "more power to them" to encourage women in this field versus their previous verdict of being a little discouraging. So next we'll move on to women's experiences in the shipyard and their work. One of the first 5 women hired who decided to remain anonymous referred to her work starting at the shipyards as one of her first jobs as she was only 18 years old. Though in beginning of her employment, she helped in the shipyards by greasing the tracks for the SS Victoria Park. Once this was done, she was later tasked with confirming employees were working, checking their clocking cards, and running around the yards to find them. She found this work unfulfilling and frustrating, and just as she was going to quit, she was offered a position in the plumbing department. For the rest of her employment at the shipyards, she worked installing pipes on ships, as well as varnishing and welding. Young women, as I mentioned, were often preferred for hiring, and some were as young as 16 years old. And Rosina Vanier was one of the best-known workers at the Pictou shipyard, and she's photographed right here. You'll see she's holding a scoop of hot rivets there to your right. And as she was pictured here in January of 1943, she's scooping up rivets after they've been used. In a Nova Scotian translation, Rosina Vanier is often known as the Canadian version of Rosie the Riveter, who's a classic American World War II female shipyard worker. And she was pictured as strong and bold. The photographs here, at least the 2 on the sides here, are taken by R.G. Edwards, who we'll talk about a little more later, but these were published to a local paper. Tensions existed between men and women. Some men did not care at all who they worked with, it didn't make a difference to them, but others felt very threatened by their new co-workers. And a number of sentiments from different men contributed to this attitude. First, some men simply believed that women weren't good enough to perform the tasks that they did, and that their place was in the home, and they had no business being in the same workplace as them. Secondly, women were paid lower wages than men to do similar work. And even though the pay was more than women have received in most other industries, it was still less than their male counterparts. And this meant that employers could theoretically hire more women at a lower cost, and in turn could make them more appealing to hire. And men feared that this would make them less preferred candidates for the job and be less likely to keep their positions for the future. Thirdly, as more women were hired, this meant fewer men had jobs and that men would be outnumbered in the workplace. Men may receive more pressure to join the military with fewer positions to fill on the home front, as it may be seen that women could take care of these jobs. Now, not all men wanted this fate, as of course traveling across and joining the military was a very dangerous feat at the time, and some people preferred to contribute at home. And of course this was no fault of the women looking for employment, but some male employees did hold grudges against them because of this. Often they were teased, being asked to find a part or a tool that didn't exist in the workplace, or they were called she-males. Because they were wearing pants, they were in a men's environment, and they were, of course, much more masculine because of this in the eyes of many men. And how untrue that is in our perspective now. Sexual harassment rarely happened at the shipyards, at least that we know of, but in recorded cases when it did occur, according to some researchers, women were able to take care of themselves and often stood up for themselves or for others in these positions. Of course, there is quite a possibility that there are unreported cases that we simply don't know about. Yet some women and men actually did get along very well at work. An example is with the photographer here, R.G. Edwards, that I mentioned took this picture of Rosina Vanier, and the lovely truck driver who remains anonymous, unfortunately. But he had previously been a ship's captain during World War I, and during World War II decided to take a position as the assistant general manager at the Pictou shipyards, and was nicknamed Happy because he was always so joyful, going around taking pictures of both men and women working at the Pictou shipyards. Harsh conditions created by the nature of the work represented a step outside of what women had previously experienced. In turn, women were often at the first aid center of the yards due to chemicals, due to whatever reason they've got hurt, but refused to go home when they had more serious injuries because they wanted to prove themselves to their male counterparts, and they also wanted to keep their hours as their wages were based hourly. Judged outside of work for their participation, Canada was seen as more conservative than allied powers such as the United Kingdom or the United States when it came to this type of involvement of women. One example of one of the hardest things to really balance when working outside of the home during World War II is childcare. And we have a couple examples here. The first one is the center top photo of a wonderful Mi'kmaq woman named Martin Malty, who's pictured here in January of 1943. And unfortunately that day, Miss Martin was unable to find a babysitter, so she got a little innovative and tied her baby to her back and brought her to work. As you can see, they look very happy. They're all snuggled up in their jackets, as it's quite cold out in January, as we know here in Nova Scotia, and working away. The other photo I have here is a little cartoon from a local shipbuilder's paper, and you may or may not be able to read the caption, but it says, "Here, you talk to the foreman. Explain why I didn't show up for work today." And it just goes to show, as funny as the cartoon is, the struggle that women face with balancing their family lives and balancing work. Another example of this is a woman named Miss Fields, who was actually a worker during World War I in England in industry, and had her first child around the same time. When she immigrated to Canada in 1927, her and her husband came to Nova Scotia, and her husband started working in coal mines. Unfortunately, in 1942, her husband was in an accident in a coal mine and had a very severe injury, so he became stay-at-home dad to their 10 children, ranging from 8 and up, and Miss Fields decided to go back into industrial work and worked at the shipyards. She was, partly because of this, but partly because of her older nature, nicknamed Mommy at work, and was recognized in January of 1943 and received the honor of sponsoring one of the ships that came out of the yards. And as sponsoring this ship, she was recognized for her role in the production of that very ship, but also showed the success of women in Pictou County and its aid in the war effort. Es Morris, who very thankfully for me has interviewed lots of these women, has stated that all the women she interviewed described their work as enjoyable regardless of how intimidating it was at first. It was something new and challenging. In most cases, they took the jobs for the monetary benefit they provided, or the fact that they couldn't or were not allowed to by their families to join the armed forces. And very rarely was it for patriotic reasons that they wanted to join. The industrial jobs were higher paying than jobs they previously held, even in other manufacturing industries, let alone domestic work or retail work. It was not until later in the war effort, in April of 1944, that employees received the 8-hour workday, meaning that they had time to spend with their families, and made this work-life balance a little bit easier. And though some women were grateful for this change, other women were upset because they were paid hourly, and a cut in hours meant a cut in pay for them. The community continued to praise women who worked in Pictou counties, at least throughout the newspapers, though in their personal lives that was a different manner. And for example, the Pictou Advocate published a story in late 1944 featuring 3 generations of women who worked at the Pictou shipyards. A daughter, a mother, and a grandmother all working together to help create ships for the war effort. The year 1945 would drastically change the nature of shipbuilding employment. With the end of the war in Europe in May of 1945, and later on in other places of the world, women's employment was also cut in half at the shipyards due to this, to 328 workers, while a total employment declined to 3,631 workers by 1946. And after this, work declined in the shipyards, and gradually women were sent home, despite being praised for their wartime work during the war. They were, though not always the last hired, the first fired. And the thankful notion that was often published in papers turned to a thanks for helping out, but please go home sort of sentiment. Layoffs started in 1944, and women were pushed out of their work in non-traditional fields, and of course had mixed feelings about this, as many women loved the independence and the freedom they gained from these new jobs, and of course the monetary benefit. Other women were quite happy to return to their lives as they had been before. And throughout the war, the Department of Labor experienced quite a backlash for letting women participate in war-related, non-traditional employment, with over 7,350 complaints issued in forms of letters, telegrams, and petitions. Women's emergence into a new field during the Second World War impacted not only their own lives, but what was accepted socially and in heavy industry. Family dynamics were changed, and women became responsible for aspects of the home and the work life that they had never imagined before so directly would impact their lives. Children grew up seeing their mothers and other women in their lives take on new and challenging roles, changing the ideas of gender norms. Wearing pants did not mean that women had given up their femininity, but that their femininity had passed the test of taking on men's work and making it women's work too. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions? Yes, hi.
Yes, with all these women working in very close proximity to one another, large number, I would expect there would be a problem with, say, tuberculosis. The contagious disease would spread very rapidly among all these people. And there was no treatment at all for tuberculosis at the time. So in your research, did you discover any problems such as disease or accidents that the women endured?
I haven't found anything about disease, unfortunately. I have found a few reports of accidents and women being very stubborn about going home, not only to prove themselves in the workplace and having been belong there, but because they really needed the money, and going home meant losing the wage for the day. Yes?
You mentioned in the case of the woman whose husband worked in the mines,
Mm-hmm.
and so she went to the shipyard to support the family.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense of how many women actually went to the same places that their husbands worked when they went to the war?
I did have a excerpt of a married couple that actually worked together at the shipyard.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of sweet. They ended up meeting there and then marrying there. It's kind of cute. So I have seen a couple stories about that, but not where women worked elsewhere with men and then transferred to that job.
Well, I'm thinking of the case, now, my mother worked in an industrial operation, not side by side with my father, but they worked in the same plant. But she continued working when he went off to the war.
Oh, great.
But I also seem to remember stories of cases of some women who came to work at the factory were the wives of men who had to leave the factory to go to war.
Oh, I haven't found any cases of that, but I would love to. Yes.
Kay, could you tell us something more about your sources and which ones were particularly helpful for your study?
Yeah, of course. I had the wonderful opportunity to travel to Pictou to do a lot of this research. So a lot of my research is based in the Pictou Advocate and another paper called the Fosicle, which was actually specifically made to be kind of an in-house shipyard paper, as well as there was a scholar named Morse who did a lot of the interviews with these women. She did them about 20 or 30 years ago, so a little before my time in university, but I'm really grateful for her research as well. Anybody else? Yeah.
Was the Pictou shipyard unionized at the time?
It became unionized a little bit later in the war, but women didn't necessarily receive the same unionized benefits sometimes as men did, as their union, because there weren't women before the war, was formed a bit later.
So would they have been included in the same union or different union?
I think they were two different unions, if I understand. Yes? Either one's good.
Go ahead, please.
In the United States, the federal government has a program for a lot of veterans that come back from overseas from different war conflicts. And they give priority to veterans in certain employment situations. You mentioned about the Pictou shipyards having federal contracts. But that may have played a factor in many post-war men that had served in the war coming home and given priority to replace the women that you referred to in your research.
With my understanding, yes, especially men who worked at the shipyards or done similar things throughout the Second World War, they were typically given a little more, you could say, priority, or they were seen as more long-term employees, whereas it was just assumed that women would filter out of these jobs once men came back from the war. So, unfortunately, yes. Yes?
I was wondering if you also found some studies similar to yours of other shipyards of approximately the size of Pictou in other parts of Canada or the United States, so you can do a comparison to see what the differences were and get an idea of how common was what was happening in Pictou over the shipyards around North America.
I haven't found too many specific studies, but James Pritchard has a wonderful book that overarches a lot of the different shipyards in Canada, really from Vancouver to Nova Scotia, and cross-compares them a little bit, but not in extensive detail. Yes?
What was a typical work week? 6 days, 60 hours?
That is a great question, something I have really been searching to find. From my understanding, it's shift work, so you could take on as many shifts as you wanted, and as I mentioned, the 8-hour workday wasn't necessarily in effect during most of the war, so women might have been working 10 or 12 hours a day. Unfortunately, I haven't found anything specifically to say that, so I don't want to guess too much, but from my understanding, it was more just whatever you were able to work.
8,000 working at Pictou. Okay, if you go to Pictou, you go down the hill, that's the shipyards there. 8,000 working there is a huge number. That's like 70,000 working at the Halifax shipyards today. It's a huge number. Where did all these people live?
There was a bit of a housing crisis. From my understanding, there was housing built to help accommodate, but there was a big overflow problem. A lot of people had to kind of almost commute into Pictou from other areas, or live with relatives or friends that they knew, couch crash. That is an issue I'd really like to dive into a bit more, but there was definitely a housing crisis during this time.
And also I assume, like you focus on the shipyard, but the car works in Trenton would be similar, or would it be similar?
Very similar, yeah. This is part of a thesis, and I have another chapter on the gunnery in Trenton,
Okay.
and they definitely face a very similar problem with housing. Maybe not as extensive, since they weren't quite as big, but nonetheless, a housing issue. Yes?
I'm just curious what drew you to this topic.
To be honest, when I first started, I had a completely different idea of what I wanted to do, but I sat down with John, who is one of my advisors, and saying, well, Kirby, what do you find interesting in history? What motivates you? And, of course, women's history is quite an interest to me. But also, I'm from Nova Scotia. I'm from a very working class-esque kind of family who, as I mentioned to a few other people, did a lot of factory work in past generations. And so that motivated me to look at industrialization, and this opportunity in Pictou just seemed astonishing, as it was the first place for women to work in yards. Just drew me in. Anyone else? Well, thank you very much.
I just want to say thank you so very much for your talk. I think it's just such a refreshing and interesting topic, and I think all of us would love to have opportunities to learn more about these types of things, particularly women's history. So thank you so much, and we want to give you, on behalf of the Royal Nova Scotia Historical Society, a little token of our appreciation.
Thank you so
And
much.
once again, thank you so much for being our speaker this evening.
Thank you.
And I think that brings us to the